Now, we've already gone outside of the book on several occasions. And to show something, I think this is the book that I had when I was going through interpersonal communication in my bachelor's program. So that's a while back. This is the current one that they're bringing onto campus, but it's not yet here. So there's that version. And then finally, there's this version, which is the version you're currently working out of. Now, this might throw off things a little bit because in this version here, we get an entire chapter on gender. In this version, we get a paragraph. And anyone that's actually paying attention to the world around us, a paragraph doesn't capture gender roles and gender identity in today's world. And for that reason, we're going away from the book, and I'll promise you, this will be the second easiest quiz you've taken in this course. What we want to talk about is the variation between sex and gender, gender fluidity, traits of gender, and gender and relationships. Because when we're talking about gender, we're talking about something that is truly part of our authentic self, who we're attracted to, how we express ourselves, and the world in which we form those interpersonal connections. Now, as I said, the quiz will be easy because right here is your answers. The reason why I want to do this is because this begins a good starting point for conversation. And like I have always said, the quiz isn't as important as the concepts and the ideas, and that you're developing your own feelings on these things so that you may better interact and have better communication skills. The first one, gender is identified by identity is a unique individual experience and personal identity. In other words, my gender identity is not necessarily your gender identity and doesn't have to be someone else's gender identity. It is a unique experience. It is our own expression. Gender stereotypes are reinforced through family, media, and use of descriptive language, strong versus bossy, etc. Now, these are gender roles or stereotypes that we normally see. When we think of the masculine man, we always have a picture of something in our head, but that isn't necessarily the true identity. It's a stereotype. And as a stereotype, it can be misleading and incorrect. Our next question is, gender is a social construct. Yes. Now, the reason why I said it's a social construct is because we have a desire within society to identify people, and so we construct a gender identity for them. However, when we're talking about our authentic selves, who we love and who we're attracted to is completely our own. So it's a social construct in that it's required by social to create these. However, it's not necessarily defining of who we are. The Kinsey scale, which we will talk about in a little while, has a lot more than 2 forms of attraction. But the thing is, we'll also point out some of the weaknesses in the Kinsey scale. And then the final one, the view of gender is dynamic and changing. Yes, even going back to our books. Each of these books have a different definition of gender and have different roles and all these other constructs. So even in academics, our view of what gender is evolving and changing. We're learning and hopefully getting better at it. Understanding gender. Shift within society of how gender is perceived. Gender is polarizing. Virtually every aspect of human experience is conducted as a male-female distinctions. And this is true. When we were young, our family had gender roles that they tried to enforce upon us and create for us. And now we're starting to move away from that. We used to think, oh, home ec is for one group and sports is for the other group. But now we're seeing people can achieve in either aspect of it. So gender is definitely changing. And we used to have more of a binary perception, but it was more of a limited perception than a true perception. Because binary does not fit the gender roles that we're now seeing and that people are now feeling free to express themselves. Those have always been there, it's just the ability to express. And categorized as high or low. People love putting numbers on things. And we'll see that when we get to the Kinsey scale. When we're saying, oh, they're high in this and they're low in that. Well, they're still just who they are. Gender is fluid, discarding a binary definition of gender. Yeah, we can't have that. You know, it's more fluid, it's more dynamic. And it's like when we're talking about culture, the more people are allowed to express themselves, the more perspective we have on the world in which we live. Consider the symbolic importance of preferred pronouns they, them, he. These, we actually have to start like with culture and let people express what they want to be identified as. If they want a they or them attached to their identity, or he or she, or whatever. But this is another example of when we talked about in culture, allow people to educate you. Now, gender or sex. And this is also where we run into a lot of the conflict that people see. Sex is an anatomical biological distinction, okay? That's just hard science stuff, but it really has nothing to do with the inner person, all right? Gender is a broad term encompassing the social, psychological, behavioral attributes that associates it to an individual. And this little picture here kind of says gender is in the head and in the heart, okay? And the sex is in the biological aspect of it. So there is a distinction there, but that doesn't necessarily dictate who a person is. So to sum up with that first portion, sex is basically a biological distinction. And there are people born with both sets of sexual organs. So to say that's binary is also incorrect. Gender, on the other hand, is more of an individual self-expression, and it's unique and an individualized experience. It varies from person to person. Now on to the Kinsey scale. The Kinsey scale was created in 1948. So there are going to be very definite limitations to it. But it was the first attempt to understand that there was a broad, wide variety of gender identity in the world, that it wasn't just binary, that it was much more complex, and it was much more of a self-expression than it was a binary function. And they gave 40 different terms to identify sexual orientation in the scale. Here's part of that scale. And as you can see, it kind of bases it on sexual attraction. So there's going to be some limitations we're going to talk about here about this. But think about this. So this was a starting point, but it's not an end point. I think we're learning and we're developing it socially and culturally to understand more and to be more dynamic in our approach to gender and orientation. Healthline.com brings out some important questions about the Kinsey scale. Like I said, that scale is over 60, 70 years old. Wow, that's an old scale. So there are faults that we find in it. It's a starting point, but it doesn't account for certain aspects. It doesn't account for people that there's a difference between a romantic attraction and a sexual orientation. Is it possible to be sexually attracted to people of one gender and romantically attracted to people of another? Yeah. It doesn't account for people who are asexual, people that don't have a sexual desire, that they don't have a need for that, and that's not part of their life. Another part is people don't like being identified as a number. I mean, that's really kind of dehumanizing, and it doesn't account for the dynamic aspects of life, that life is very dynamic and changing. And you might meet some people that truly change your perception on things. So they're uncomfortable being identified. There are only 7 points on the scale. I mean, wow, that's not very many. I mean, we have more quizzes than that in the class. There are arguably infinite ways to express sexual attraction. True. 2 people who are 3 on the Kinsey scale, for example, may have different sexual histories, feelings, and behaviors. So when you try to group them together, you're not really encompassing who they are and letting them be the authentic self. It assumes gender is binary. No, we're not either masculine or feminine. There's different aspects to us. People are unique. It introduces bisexuality to a point where homosexuality and heterosexuality. According to the Kinsey scale, when interest in a person of one gender increases, interest in the person of another decreases. That's kind of like our whole fallacy of limitation, where we feel that, oh, well, I only have so much love to give in the world, or I only have so much attention to give in the world. And for that reason, it kind of limits it, and that's not true. That's not a limited resource. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, do you think this is a good starting point and it has some cons? Do you think it's all pros? Do you think it's all cons? Which way do you go? How do you feel about it? Once again, when we're talking about gender identity, we're talking about self-reflection and finding authentic self. And both of those we've talked about extensively on developing who we are and how we communicate with people and how we interact with them. Gender is learned. Yes, it is in some ways, especially when we're talking about socially. There's social expectations, and we're starting to see that change. I mean, even though you're still seeing on YouTube when they're doing the announcement party and they're going to release the balloons or the smoke or have flags with flying overhead up behind planes, what they do is, oh, it's a boy, so it's going to be blue smoke. Oh, it's a girl, it's going to be bright pink smoke. But even before the child is born, here we are. We're assigning a gender role to them. It's kind of odd, but it's true. So reveal parties do have that aspect, and that's still popular today. Gender is a social construct. Assigned norms, expectation, enforced through social structures like bathrooms. Think about it. A decade ago, there wasn't a gender-neutral bathroom. Now we're starting to see those. So we're starting to see there's a social construct aspect to gender. There's also a change. Culture and society don't stay stagnant. They're dynamic as well. And forces within them change them. Shared expectations for conduct and behavior. That again is changing. No longer do we say, well, the boy's going to get the fire truck and the girl's going to get the dolls. Now it's like, what do you want to play with? And I think that's a good step forward. Traits of gender. These are some of the stereotypes we see. And with stereotypes, we always have to remember they can be very negative and very bad idea. And actually force us to create masks and force us to create roles outside of who we truly want to be and express ourselves as. So male stereotypes, few words, cursing, physically intimidating, to the point. But that's an expectation. So when we find someone that doesn't, we treat them differently, and then we're not letting them be themselves. Female, many words, less aggressive, both verbally and non-verbally. You decide. I don't think so. I think these are individual traits. They're not just traits of gender. It is the case of you need to find out who you are and express it through that. So these are stereotypes, and stereotypes limit how we interact and perceive another person. Bottom line, men dominate media. And that's one thing that's kind of an interesting thing. When we start talking about it being a social construct, traditionally, it's been the male version of what a woman is, not a woman version of what a woman is. And I think we saw that a lot in early television, even into the 90s with shows like Friends. We saw that it was a perception of what someone else is instead of themselves expressing it. Like this one, it shows that in media, television, online, etc., 63.4% is all male-driven content. Male are creating the content. 36% is women, and less than 1% we haven't assigned a gender to, so we are not knowing what exactly is being expressed. But really, when we start thinking about it, shouldn't it be more important that people are demonstrating the positive roles that they feel towards their gender and towards themselves, expressing themselves in a positive way? Gender and relationships. Because of this, that we see these dominant roles being portrayed and expectations being cast upon them, we automatically assume this is how a relationship needs to be. And that can be very damaging to it. Instead, we need to let people express who they are and how they feel. Friendships, tokenism. Tokenism is a case of where someone's included in your social group to prove your social group doesn't have a stereotype or doesn't have a prejudice. So they bring someone in and it's kind of a token. And we see that in business, we see it in race relationships, we see it in cultural aspects, and that's another negative. Romantic relationships. I mean, what are they expected, when you go out to dinner with someone, what are you expected to do? And is it necessarily how you feel, or are you trying to live up to a social expectation because you both have grown up in the same society, and so you feel that's the role they expect? Meanwhile, what they really want to do is find the authentic you and find who you are, which is more important in a long-term relationship. So I added this little extra part in there for you. I've given you the answers for the quiz. However, I feel like we just barely have started touching on this conversation, because gender identity is so much of who we are. It is so much creates our sphere of influence, our identity, how we feel about ourselves, our esteem. And that reason, it is an important conversation to have. By no means have I given a definitive answer on this topic, because it's something we're still learning. It's still something that is dynamically developing, and it's allowing people to be their authentic selves. And that's something we always encourage. Please, on this part, post any of your thoughts. Be respectful, but let's explore the topic and let's see how we feel and how we can discuss this. Because by discussing this, it gets more than a chapter or paragraph in the book. It becomes a book, which there are books and there are courses out there. So this is kind of a brief introduction. It's not comprehensive, but I'm looking forward to your discussion.